who we are today. In the Industrial Revolution, when that change took place, about 100 years worth of time, it was an era in which Marlborough, because of what we did in the shoe industry, was a leader. You don't see it in the history books, I don't know why. Yet we were very important, as was all of New England, not just the industry up in Lowell, in what became our new way of living, an industrialized society, cities, working in a factory. Started in 1837, basically, not yet mechanized, making 103 pairs of shoes, kind of the beginning of an era. Samuel Boyd is the name of the man who's associated with this. He's born in Marlborough, grows up in Marlborough. He's looking to make his fortune in his way in life, as did the folks of that era. And everyone said to him, "You can't do that in Marlborough, we're a farm town." And he said, "I'm born here, these are my people, I'll find my way to make my fortune in this farm town." And he did. Right? 1837, 103 pairs of shoes, about 150 workers, the beginnings. They were using pegs, wooden pegs, to put the soles on the shoes. And actually, this is a little before it. This is a cobble shop version, sewn together. So what they learned was a small factory, putting the soles on with little pegs, forming the leather, and they can make more than one every 3 weeks. And I'm not kidding, by the way. They could make pairs that you could buy and have within a day or two. Major, unknown, not a little cobble making anymore, a small factory producing shoes that everybody could buy when they need them. In 1842, that's when this thing really took off. Looking at the fact that everybody needs shoes. So Samuel, along with his brother John, said, "We gotta find a way to mechanize this." So his brother John invented something. And this is the key to the Industrial Revolution. This is a die. He said, if we do this right, we can punch out 30, 40, 50 pieces of soles in different sizes instead of hand cutting them. If we do this right, we can make so many shoes a day that the entire world can be supplied by us. And if we do this right, we can employ a whole bunch of people and give them a better way of life. The die. They invented it. That became something which was found in terms of manufacturing and almost every type of manufacturing process. But it was John Boyd who invented it in 1842. Gave Marlborough a giant advantage over everyone else because they didn't have that. Okay? In 1845, something else happens. Typical shoe, beautiful shapes. How do you think they got the shape? Well, in the agrarian society, you had a cobbler who might come to your house, figure out how to wrap the leather around you, cut it, make it, maybe even live at your house while they were doing it, and finally you had a shoe that better last you until you were 400 years old. And you pass it down from generation to generation. Well, we need shoes, so what Mr. Boyd and his brother and his staff did is they said, why don't we do something like this? Let's make a last, which is like a mold. It's adjustable. Now we can wrap the leather around this. We don't have to cut it and paste it. We'll have it so we can make different sizes for different people, and we can mass produce shoes that really fit. Major step forward. Industrialization. They got the die, they got the last, they could assemble shoes like lightning quick, and they could make them fast enough for people's consumption. Notice what I said. I didn't say anything about, oh, and by the way, we're gonna go down to a farm and build this one. I said, we're gonna build a factory and make us lots. The Industrial Revolution. And what happens when you have an Industrial Revolution or a change like that? Well, let's look at some of the employment figures. Because we were becoming an industrial society instead of an agrarian society, well, now this new factory environment needs workers, people leaving the farms. Because they can go to the city, they can work, they know how long a day they're going to work, they're going to get paid for what they do, and because they know how much money they're going to get, not is my crop going to make it or not, because they know how much money they can get, they can start doing things like, maybe I can get a house. And now I can afford to go buy at the general store where they have all those things I couldn't buy. Total change in the way people live. Look at the population structure. This is the other impact. This shows the significance of that change. In 1836, when Samuel Boyd first began, little children's shoes is what they were making. Okay? Population of Marlborough at that time, still a town, about 1,800. In 1855, there are a few changes, like John O'Connell builds the first factory sewing machine. We can sew, no more peg. We can mass produce, just run it through that thing, beautiful singer. Okay? And so, at that time period, in 1855, it seems we went from 1,800 to 4,288 people in this small town. Just because of a little change in the factory, people said, bigger factory, more work, I'm going there. Kids were leaving the farms. Their parents were leaving the farms. They were going where they could earn a wage and depend on it. Major change. You'll also notice displacement of jobs. Does that sound familiar? Because the folks who were only trained to work on the farm and were not attuned to city life or working in a factory, what did they do? So you see, a lot of what happens in major socio-economic change, we see in the Industrial Revolution. And so if we study it and understand it, we can take some lessons out of it, perhaps, in terms of how to deal with our changes today, which is the global economy, and the way it's making our world change. But to continue with the shoes, in 1854, another major factory built by a competitor, John O'Connell, right along a railroad siding. Why? Because the leather shipments could be brought directly into the factory. No hand transfers from some station far away, maybe in Hudson, and immediately into the factory, immediately out for shipping. Look how quickly they could supply demand. In 1854, well, we started in 1837 with 103,000 pairs of shoes being made, roughly 41,000 in value. In 1854, because we've got to last the sewing machine that died, 2 million pairs made. What a quantum leap. In that same year, $1,157,000 worth of goods and services. Now you know what million was, or might have been back in 1855. Started out at 41.2, it's 1,000,005, and it didn't take that long, did it? The factory industrial revolution was working. And Marlborough, because it was inventing the tools by which you would manufacture, quantum leaps ahead of all their competition. And what they were doing was emulated in other industrial type situations. Totally changed the way we live, as you can see. If you look at the population in 1860, 1855 was 4,200, 1860 it's 5,900. In 1866, sorry Hudson, you know, we could be mad at you for this. You took 1,800 of our population when you broke away as a town. But we made up for it because
That's all right.
that's all right. Our kids live in Hudson. It's a good town. In 1890, we became a city and we had a population of 13,000 people because that shoe industry grew and expanded and could employ them all. Now today, that's a small city. In that era, being a city in its own right was major because the city meant you were a center of commerce. And there were not a lot of cities. But that kind of population is basically saying, we have now created a life, a different kind of life for 13,000 people. And more to come, you know, as the years went by. So that's what the Industrial Revolution was about, and that's why Marlborough is so important in it, because of what they did. This is all human innovation. This is all thinking about needs and figuring out a better way to fill a need. That's what that Industrial Revolution was about. Now, if you look at the years again, in 1858, a steam engine. What's that? Oh, let's take a steam engine and let's put it in our factories because it can really make a lot of power to power all our machines. Marlborough leads the way. The first steam engine sets up in the Marlborough factory. Only 1 horsepower. But boy, could it get the job done. Notice we don't have laborers doing it though now. We have a machine and steam doing most of the work, and the laborers are setting up and doing the finishing. So we now have figured out how to marry industry with people. And that's the way we're going to live. We're going to work with machines alongside of machines. We're not going to work by ourselves anymore. And that's what that means. And I'll tell you something about income, which is interesting. Factory superintendent made 25 bucks a week, which was a lot of money. And a foreman would work and make about 17 to 22 bucks a week, which is a lot of money. So you didn't make that on the farm. So if you wanted to be able to grow, and there were factories opening all the time, I think at one point there was 20 some odd shoe factories in the Marlborough area, you could actually make a pretty darn good living if you joined in with the Industrial Revolution. And that's why it had such a drastic, absolute social and economic change on the way we were as a country and what we became to the rest of the world. We did become the leaders of the Industrial Revolution. And that's why an artifact by itself, a museum piece with a story behind it, it's the key to who we are. In 1879, 586 sewing machines. In 1879, 308 steam engines. In 1879, 2,655,000. That's what the industry was worth, with over 3,000 employees in 22 independent shops, more to come, and all kinds of ancillary related businesses like the general store, like all the other things that grow up in a downtown, like a whole downtown growing up, a whole city, and the houses around it being built so people could live in it. Everything had changed. And if you ask the average citizen at that time what it's like to grow an apple tree, they might say to you, "What's an apple tree?" And that's what was happening around the country. We didn't really have a choice. The mechanization had taken its roots. You joined it, you lived with it, you grew with it, or you didn't. If you didn't, you'd be trying to eke out your living on the farm, so to speak. Well, look what we did. We changed so drastically as a result of what was going on in Marlborough, being a leader of all this, and Marlborough being significant of what was happening around our country. In 1887 rather, John Fry, we know who that is, one of the most famous boot brand names in the world. This is the original boot made by the Fry factory. And 1888 is when the factory opened. What does this become? Global, standard, international, made in Marlborough. Right? And one of the things Fry did that made a major change, in addition with Samuel Boyd and his colleagues, is that in 1887, to make sure his factory could work, he installed an electricity generator. What's electricity? Never heard of it. Fry says, the heck with all the steam. And the heck with having to power the steam. There is this thing called electricity. Let's put it to work and it'll run the machines. You know where it went from there? Everything became electrified. Right? So, by 1910, there were 3 major companies and lots of smaller companies, but the 3 major companies alone made 7 million pairs of shoes to the tune of $15 million worth of revenue. So in 1837, $41,200 in the beginning factory. Not that much later in 1910, $15 million worth of revenue and over 7 million pairs of shoes around the globe. And as you can see, the Industrial Revolution all went with it, the lifestyle went with it. It certainly was here to stay. There are a couple other things that go along with that. You know, we've all learned in high school or college or wherever we learn our history about the robber barons in the era of the Industrial Revolution. Well, you could be a robber baron, but you could also be what Samuel Boyd was. In 1855 actually, he started something called he financed a branch of a railroad. You see, the railroads bypassed Marlborough. And so Boyd said, we need them to connect. We're going to ship around the globe. Now, he had competitors up in Haverhill and elsewhere that were nowhere near as far advanced as we were, but he had to get permission to expand the railroad from the state legislature. They were, you know, no, we're in bed with Haverhill. So he said, you know, we're not going to build it myself. And he built it. It linked to the entire national railroad system. And that day, like planes and trucks are today, if you didn't have a railroad connection, you had no business. So he said, I'll make my own railroad connection. 2 years later, they approved it because they said it was already built. But that opened Marlborough to the world. So that means global supplier now. Income, influx, hotels, everything to take care of people who would come to town to do business, restaurants. He also did things like, his factory office was the counting house. It was a savings bank until Marlborough Savings Bank opened, which was incorporated in 1860. So he gave us a place not only to make money, but also to put it away safely, and maybe get a little interest on it. And it would also loan out money to other businesses who said, I want to open, maybe it's a restaurant, maybe it's another type of supplier to things we buy every day. He put together a bank that allowed people to borrow the money to do it. Because he knew we needed this substructure and infrastructure to support the factory world. And in 1865, he did something unusual. He said, gas. You know what? I'm going to build my own gas company because I need lights in my factory. Boy, that's sure going to be able to do it. He built a gas company. And he said, you know what? Look at all the people we have living in town. Why don't we extend lines out to each of their houses? We'll charge them a little bit for the use of the gas, and we became modern. We had light day and night all throughout town. He did it. Okay? In 1870, he looked at Lake Williams, just Route 20 there on the corner, and he said, boy, that's a lot of water. Why don't we create a water department and pipe the town so we can send water to people's houses so they don't pump all day long? He established the infrastructure and the water company so that we could live a decent life. We got gas lights, we got water, and after Fry brings electricity in, we get electricity, we live well. Are we going back to the farm? The Industrial Revolution, that's what it was all about, making life better in our time, not in some future time, and using your brain, as these folks at Marlborough did, and many others around the country, to create, yes, change, yes, a different way of life, but as you did it, you could also create a way of life that was worth living, which is why all these civic events are so important. In 1883, for instance, the shoe industry, with, of course, Samuel being the sponsor of it, put together a skating rink, and later when that became defunct, they turned it into a public meeting hall, and ultimately became the first theater in 1888 for Marlborough, because he thought the arts, theater, everything that goes with that side of life should be available to all these people who live in our cities and towns, because why not? We got to have a place to enjoy. We got to have a place to learn. So he built the theater. He turned it into a theater. Another pioneering thing. Remember, this is not evil, is it? It doesn't mean that the industrial era is evil. It doesn't mean that change is evil. And it doesn't mean that everyone in charge of the big company, as we saw from Hudson, is an evil ogre. What he did, what he said he was going to do, which was give back to his community and make it good for the people who lived in his town, he did. He lived what he said. In 1887, he looked at his factories. Samuel Boyd did, rather. Morse invented the telegraph. Samuel Boyd looks at his factory workers and says, okay, they are having trouble getting in on time. I can't produce as much if it's not in on time. So he built an electric railroad all throughout downtown and out to some of the outskirts so his workers could get here on time. He charged a penny for the ride. And he said, you know what? I'm going to charge only a penny because why should my workers be held up in the factory all day long working, toiling? They get a half hour or so for lunch or whatever it was. He said, take the railroad, go home, spend time with your family, come on back to work. That's why he built it. So he's looking out for the welfare and the well-being of people, even though he's richer than God. So that's part of what this was all about. This is what the artifacts we bring with us represent. An entire change in the way we lived. The entire conversion from an agrarian society to an industrial society, which is well into the 1950s, is what we led at. The entire conversion of how we lived our lives, houses, apartments, streetcars, downtowns, buying our supplies instead of making it. That's what those artifacts mean in terms of Marlborough history and ultimately the rest of the world. So, I appreciate you hearing the story, and hopefully, if we look back at this, maybe the way they managed to change from one way of living, which had been established and been there forever, the agricultural world, and moved into a whole different way of living, which was the Industrial Revolution, away from the farms into the cities, indirect labor, indirect buying, maybe because we now live in an era of change once again, called the global economy, which is changing the way we've always known how we're going to earn our livings and how we're going to work, is displacing some people from traditional jobs that won't come back, just like it did in the Industrial Revolution. Maybe if we look at some of what those folks did, we can apply some of their approaches, especially what they did with people, to make this transition smooth, workable, and valuable. So thank you for hearing us out today.
Thank you very much. I wanted to know if you had those boots in a size 10.
We got a brand new pair, actually, yes, it might be a 10.
No, thank you very much. That was really informative. I've always known about the shoe factories in Marlborough, but never really knew quite the extent of how that all worked. So thank you very much. That was really interesting.
I live in one of the houses that were built for workers.
Oh, do you have questions? I'm
Oh, sorry, I have questions
I
for
should
Neil
say
first.
that.
So go ahead. Why don't you start, Sue?
My husband and I live in one of the houses that were built for the workers. And when he was replacing some of the stuff in the ceilings, he found some artifacts.
Really?
It dated back to like what?
There was a woman's application to join the union.
Yeah,
It says right on it, women's application.
yeah. My wife, who's here today, Jen, is president of the Marlborough Historical Society. We want those.
What else did you
And she
find?
owns, my wife owns a house that was one of the workers' houses. And notice what he's saying, the workers' houses. They were built to house the workers. Houses, not tents, and you live in one.
Yeah.
So you know how they were built.
Yeah, we found
Oh, yeah,
we
we
found
know.
a census from 1920 and 1930, and the French Canadians that lived there, they wrote down their occupations, and one was a stitcher, another one just wrote work in a shoe factory.
Mhm.
And the factory was right on the corner,
Yeah,
where the fire station is now on Pleasant Street.
yeah.
That's so cool.
Did you find any more artifacts?
There was a raffle where the grand
Did you
prize
win?
was a live pig.
Yeah.
This is 1930 or something.
Wow, wow.
Any other questions, observations? Yes.
What was the dye made out of? Was that forged iron? Or
Forged.
Uh-huh.
They didn't quite, well, if they didn't have a die to make the die, they had to forge it, which they did. See, when you think of it, it's pretty ingenious when you figure out, I'm gonna get this very strong metal, and I'm gonna pound it into shape, I'm gonna heat it, I'm gonna mold it, but it's gonna become my factory. Eventually, you could mold dies, because you could build the molds and mold them. That was hand-built, and that was made to spec, so they could create very specific sizes and shapes and stamp out a ton instead of only a little. And if you got a ton to work with, you can certainly put it together quickly. Right? So, the stitching idea, the sewing machine, in building what you're saying, what that allowed for, and this